last week for class, you were required to read chapters 3, 4, and 5 in the Red Badge of Courage and complete some discussion questions about each of those chapters. For this week's direct instruction, we're going to take a look at those 3 chapters. And throughout the video, once again, there are some questions about the chapter. As you are viewing the video, I encourage you to pause the video when the questions come up, answer the questions in another screen, and then come back to the video once you are ready to move on. So let's get started with chapter 3. In chapter 3, the reader is plunged headfirst into the battle. The troops begin to move rapidly towards the war and towards the fighting. And we also see this continued shift of Henry's perspective towards war. A quote from the book says, "As he perceived this fact, it occurred to him that he had never wished to come to war. He had not enlisted of his free will. He had been dragged by the merciless government, and now they were taking him out to be slaughtered." Okay, so you start to see these very negative feelings about being enlisted and being in this war, and how he's starting to feel like he didn't do this to himself, and the government just wants him to go into the war to be killed. In this chapter, we also can see the influence of photography at this time. You have to remember that because Crane never saw battle, he was never a soldier, he was never enlisted, he relied on photographs taken during this time to add to the realism of his writing. So he would be referring to these photographs in order to be able to describe the landscapes and what was going on. Matthew Brady and other photographers, Matthew Brady being one of the most famous, shocked the public with their harsh images of war. They were often very graphic. So I would like to look at 2 things, and I apologize, but this is an actual picture from the war of a dead Confederate soldier laying in a ditch with his gun, and actually another gun laying there too. And we're comparing it with this passage from chapter 3, which I will read to you. "Once the line encountered the body of a dead soldier. He lay upon his back, staring at the sky. He was dressed in an awkward suit of yellowish brown. The youth could see that the soles of his shoes had been worn to the thinness of writing paper, and from a great rent in one the dead foot projected piteously. And it was as if fate had betrayed the soldier. In death it exposed to his enemies that poverty which in life he had perhaps concealed from his friends. The ranks opened covertly to avoid the corpse. The invulnerable dead man forced a way for himself. The youth looked keenly at the ashen face. The wind raised the tawny beard. It moved as if a hand were stroking it. He vaguely desired to walk around and around the body and stare. The impulse of the living to try to read in dead eyes the answer to the question." And this brings us to your first question for this week. Question number 1. How does Crane's passage compare to the reality shown in the photograph? What words from the following list would you use to describe both the image and the passage? Anonymous, bias, courageous, famous, heroic, realistic, romanticized, static, unbiased, vivid? Why? Are there any other words that you would add? Again, at this time, I encourage you to pause the video, answer the question, and then return to the video when you are ready. In chapter 4, Henry directly sees the effects of battle for the first time, but he still isn't close enough that he can actually see the enemy. Here's a quote from this chapter. "The battle reflection that shone for an instant in the faces on the mad current made the youth feel that forceful hands from heaven would not have been able to have held him in place if he could have got intelligent control of his legs. There was an appalling imprint upon these faces. The struggle in the smoke had pictured an exaggeration of itself on the bleached cheeks and in the eyes wild with one desire." So pretty much Henry's saying that he would have run at this point if he had the chance. He was not ready to stick around. He didn't want to see the enemy. He didn't want to get that close. You also have to consider the emotions that Crane is conveying in this short passage. The idea of horror, fear, exhaustion, and madness that both Henry is facing and that he's seeing on the eyes of in the faces of these other soldiers. In addition, Crane starts to build tension as the soldiers wait to see the enemy. So they're just hanging back waiting as all these other soldiers are returning from war. And this tension starts to build as to what's going to happen with Henry when he does finally engage in the battle. This brings us to our second question. The reader is given the third-person limited point of view, Henry's, for the approaching battle. What effect does this limited point of view have on the reader? Do you think that it makes you feel closer to the battle or farther away? Why? Again, I encourage you to pause the video at this point, answer the question, and then return to the video when you are through. Alright, moving on to Chapter 5. In Chapter 5, Henry demonstrates his courage as a soldier. Doubts are put aside and he becomes a soldier almost unthinkingly. Question number 3. In Chapter 5, it says that he became not a man, but a member. What does that mean? What is he trying to say in this one line? Continuing Chapter 5. We're given a glimpse of what happens to soldiers who try to desert or run with the young soldier who was caught and beaten by the lieutenant. Okay? So we're starting to see the kind of negative side of being a soldier. And we, as the readers, along with Henry, are also given our first view of what it looks like after a battle. Okay, so we're seeing these men returning, wounded and mangled and broken. The end of this chapter brings us to our next and final question. Henry comments on nature at the end of this chapter. He is amazed that the sky remains blue and the sun continues to shine. Why is Henry amazed at this? What is Crane saying about both war and nature in making such comments? This is the last question for this week's direct instruction. Please make sure that you have written good, detailed, complete answers for each of the 4 questions. Submit them in the submission box for this assignment. As always, if you have any questions about your reading or any of the assignments, please make sure that you email me. Thanks and have a good week.